Thank you very much for, thank you all very much for being here. I know it's late in the UK. Uh, so what I'm going to do today, and it's also in Cambridge, which is one of my favorite places. I'm trying to think about this as virtual. Uh, so what I'm going to do today is try to put together ideas from really two areas of research that I think are relevant to the ideas behind this workshop and indeed this project. One of them is evolutionary biology, and questions about how intelligence evolved and where intelligence comes from in many, many different kinds of species beyond humans. And the other is artificial intelligence and the ways that we might abstractly think about building intelligences. And what I'm going to do in this talk is put those two ideas and those two areas of research together with some of the empirical work that I and others have been doing in developmental psychology. And what I'm going to argue is that something that will be, I think, very amenable to this group. I'm going to argue that, in fact, rather than thinking about intelligence as being this kind of single measure, the single unit, we should, or even thinking about intelligences in different domains, as people do sometimes, like a difference between emotional intelligence and cognitive intelligence. Instead, what I want to suggest is that there are actually multiple kinds of intelligence and that they trade off against each other. That actually doing well in one, the kinds of capacities you need to do some of these are in tension with the kinds of capacities that you need to perform other kinds of intelligence. And in particular, I'm going to talk about three different kinds: exploitation, exploration. Those are ideas that you'll recognize from the computer science and neuroscience literature. But also a third, which I think is more neglected, which is what I'll call care/teaching, another kind of intelligence. And what I'll suggest is that all three of these are deeply implicated in human capacities, and that we really need to be able to have all three of these in order to be able to develop something like an artificial general intelligence. And in particular, one of the things that I want to emphasize is that these various kinds of intelligences trade off against each other. And in particular, they trade off against each other in the course of development. So a common picture of intelligence, cognition in general, is that it reaches its peak in whoever your local boy genius philosopher of 35 is in his armchair, and that everything else is just sort of building up to the 35-year-old boy genius, and then everything, and then sort of falling off as we get older. And I don't think that's a very realistic picture from an evolutionary perspective of how intelligence would work. If it was so great to be the 35-year-old boy genius philosopher, then we could just be born with that kind of intelligence. So instead, what I'm going to suggest is that you actually see different kinds of intelligence at different points in development, and that in particular, exploration and care are at their peak in periods of development that we don't pay as much attention to, namely childhood and elderhood. Okay, so the sort of general perspective that I'm going to be talking about comes from an idea in evolutionary biology that's been extremely influential in evolutionary biology itself, but oddly hasn't been imported very much into cognitive science. And this is the idea of life history. And this is a special issue of the Philosophical Transactions that just came out last year. I guess now it's last summer. Looking at the relationship between this idea of life history and more cognitive questions about cognition and intelligence. And I highly recommend it. So what is life history? Well, life history is the developmental trajectory of an organism. So the kinds of factors that you consider in life history are things like how long childhood a species has, how long a period of immaturity it has, when it becomes fertile, how many children it has, how much parental investment there is in those babies, how long it lives in general. And it turns out that those features of a species are often extremely important from an evolutionary perspective. So often what seems to be selected in the course of evolution is not a particular morphology, for instance, but a particular life history, a slightly longer or earlier developmental trajectory, slightly more or slightly have I been, I just muted, Henry?
Yeah, sorry, just for a split second, sorry.
Um, uh, so uh, if you were, if you could imagine a evolutionary biologist from Alpha Centauri who had come to Earth in the Pleistocene and was looking at these little creatures that were scampering around on the veldt and wanted to figure out what was distinctive and different about them, she would not have seen giant differences in things like their theory of mind or their tool use or their general intelligence at that point in human development. We know from recent comparative work that a lot of the elements of culture, of tool use, of theory of mind seem to be present in our close primate relatives. But what she would have noticed is the really distinctive life history of the early Homo sapiens compared to the other primates. Because what she would have seen is that from the time that humans evolved, we had twice as long a period of childhood as the other primates. So if you look even in forager cult, this is a chimpanzee in the Gombe, and by the time that this chimp is 7, not I think much older than Henry's son, that chimp would be producing as much food as he was consuming, which I am fairly sure that Luke is not doing. And in fact, even in forager cultures, children aren't producing as much food as they're consuming until they're well into adolescence, till they're 15 or so. And in our culture, we still write mortgage and tuition checks for our 30-year-olds. So that's a big difference. And it's expensive. It's an expensive difference too, because not only are those children not producing, but but they're actually consuming resources, and those resources have to be provided by the adults and the other members of the group. And at the same time, they would also have seen that, again, kind of paradoxically, not only is this true, but the Homo sapiens are actually producing more babies. So there's shorter interbirth intervals for humans than there are for our closest primate relatives. Our babies are more closely spaced together. So we're actually stacking up these helpless babies. On the other hand, what she would have also seen is this very distinctive postmenopausal grandmotherhood in females. So as we'll see, very few animals have this phenomenon where they live for 20 years past the end of their fertility. If you look again at our closest primate relatives like chimps, by the time chimp females are 50, they stop being fertile, but they also die. So chimps in general die when they're about 50. And again, as long as we can tell, and in forager cultures as well, human females are living for 20 years after that. So outliving their fertility by as long as 20 years. And again, this is an highly unusual pattern. And it's also kind of puzzling from an evolutionary perspective. Why would we continue to be around even when we're no longer directly fertile? So this Alpha Centauran biologist would have said something very strange is going on with the life history of these creatures. And assuming that Alpha Centauran biology is as advanced as we might think, she would presumably also know that this paradoxical life history with this long period of immaturity actually is correlated with other features that are distinctive about Homo sapiens: intelligence, relative brain size, especially the capacity to learn across a very wide variety of different species. So if you look at this chart, for example, these are primates, and there's a pretty clear relationship between what we think of as measures of intelligence, adaptation, learning, and weaning time. And in fact, this relationship is first noticed not even in primates at all, but in birds. So if you compare the galliforms, chickens and turkeys and so forth, to the corvids, crows, especially these New Caledonian crows, what you can see is that the chickens are basically dumb as stumps, or a better way to put it is they're extremely smart at doing a very limited number of things. And we can actually demonstrate this. The computational capacities that allow them to peck as effectively at grain as they do are in place literally from the time that they're born. and they reach maturity in about 2 weeks. If you compare that to the corvids, something like this New Caledonian crow is very smart as primates, has very sophisticated tool use abilities, very good at learning, so that it could learn to, say, use bend a wire in an Oxford lab that it's never seen before in order to get food. And these crows are fledglings for as long as 2 years, which is a very long time in the life of the bird. So you see this correlation across a really wide number of species with this extended life history, long childhood, and intelligence in adulthood. In fact, in one of my favorite recent studies, not coming from cognitive science at all, but from evolutionary biology, Emily Snell-Rood, who's an evolutionary biologist, has shown that this is even true in insects. So these are cabbage white butterflies, familiar around Cambridge. And among these cabbage white butterflies, the cabbage white butterflies in general, are really not terribly swift creatures. They have a very simple life history, which is best summarized by the very hungry caterpillar, which some of you may know from reading it to your children. So essentially what happens is they lay eggs on a nice green leaf. The eggs turn into caterpillars. The caterpillar eats the leaf. It has a cocoon, and then it in turn turns into a beautiful butterfly. But it turns out that there's variability, even with this very simple life, among different cabbage whites. So there are some cabbage whites that just seem to be designed to innately find green leaves like kale and lay their eggs on the leaves. There are other cabbage whites that are more choosy and more capable of learning. So even though they start out being attracted to just the green leaves, if they land on, say, a pink leaf that also has tracks of nutrition, they'll lay their eggs on that leaf. And moreover, these smarter butterflies will avoid a leaf that already has eggs on it that would be in competition. So you have one insect that's got a very determined, innate pattern of action, and then you have this other one that's capable of learning selectively about its environment. And it turns out that the smarter cabbage whites lay half as many eggs, and the eggs take twice as long to mature as the duller cabbage whites. So even with this, really, really different, with these very different kinds of animals making very different kinds of choices, you see this relationship between maturity and intelligence and learning. And that suggests that there's some pretty general principle that's involved in this relationship. You can actually see that this life history, as I mentioned, we actually have fossil evidence that this life history actually evolved. That if you compare, for example, this is a chart that compares teeth in Neanderthals and fossil Homo sapiens and recent Homo sapiens. And you can see that even if you're comparing Neanderthals to Homo sapiens, they seem to have matured more quickly, judged by their molar eruptions. So the Neanderthal children seem to have been getting their grown-up teeth faster than the Homo sapien children. And there's pretty good evidence across the whole fossil history for this increasing length of childhood over the period in which we evolved. You can also see some of this in the context of neuroscience. So this is a classic chart from Peter Huttenlocher that shows the development of synaptic connections over time. And what you can see is that early in development, there's many, many new connections that are being formed. You have a brain that's very open to experience, very plastic. And then there's a kind of tipping point where the connections that have been exercised a lot are myelinated and become more efficient, and the ones that haven't are pruned. And this architecture is very, very general across animals with developed brains, but it's particularly distinctive in human beings. And what you can see is that that architecture corresponds really to the period of childhood. So that depending on what kinds of capacities you're talking about, you see this pattern of an early period of plasticity and connection, very well designed for learning, but not very well designed for effective action. And then this later period where you get the benefits of effective action, but you lose the benefits of plasticity. You can see this particularly in humans with the development of the prefrontal cortex, which is sort of the executive center of the brain. And what you can see is that that's the longest part of the brain to develop. It takes a very long time to control the rest of the brain. And in fact, it isn't completed until well into adolescence. So what all this suggests is that part of the explanation, and other people have suggested this for the period of childhood, is that it gives you a kind of protected period in which you can do the kind of learning that you need to do. And again, I think there's often this kind of scala natura picture that, prefrontal cortex executive control is what you want. That's what constitutes intelligence. And babies start out kind of being dumb, and then they only gradually get smarter. And if only we could get them to have more prefrontal control earlier, then they would be even smarter. And the fact that this architecture is so ubiquitous suggests that that's not true from an evolutionary perspective. And another thing to say about this that I think is striking is that even for a lot of the recent advances in AI depend on analogies to neuroscience, but the architectures that people use, whether they're neural nets, deep learning, or deep reinforcement learning, don't have this kind of structure. So what the structure they have is just that you get more and more and more connections as you develop, rather than having this bipartite structure where you have an early period with many connections and then a period of pruning, even though that seems to really be the architecture that we see in nature, in biology. And I want to emphasize again how expensive this process is. So this is one of my favorite recent studies. And in this study, Chris Causal and colleagues looked at how many calories your brain uses at various stages of development. So you can see that even in adults, about 20% of our calories go to our brains. Our brains are they're kind of like Macs. They're these expensive computing gadgets that we have. But when you look at a 5-year-old, 66% of their calories are going to their brains. So that process of synaptic connection and pruning that I showed in the previous slide is very energetically expensive, strikingly energetically expensive. And Kuzawa and his colleagues have done really elegant work showing that you actually get a slowdown in physical growth that compensates for the fact that there's so much brain growth going on, and it's so energetically expensive. So not only are these babies expensive because they're not producing any food and you have to feed them, but they take a lot of feeding too. Having those big brains actually means a lot of peanut butter sandwiches or roots or tubers. I also like this because I think it gives a picture of what, your average 5-year-old, my 5-year-old grandson, or maybe Henry's Luke as well, which is that basically they're Doctor Who villains. They're these giant hungry brains that are perched on these little bodies and go around basically hypnotizing us into being their slaves so that we'll feed their hungry brains. And that seems like a pretty accurate picture of the average 5-year-old. Okay. Now, what was it about the environment that we were in that would have triggered this kind of really distinctive hungry life history? Well, there's lots of different hypotheses, but one of the most common ones is that what happened was that the environment became more variable and less predictable. So now humans are causing climate change, but in the past, climate change caused humans. And it wasn't just climate change in the sense of things getting hotter or drier, but climate change in the sense of things getting unpredictable. So that across a lifetime of a particular organism, there was much more flexibility and variability. And if you add in the human capacity for niche construction, our capacity to actually change our environments, that means that our environments are even more variable than just as a result of the external world. We end up with very unpredictable, variable environments. So it seems as if there's something, a way I put it sometimes is that our ecological niche is the unknown unknowns. That's what we're really designed for. And that kind of variability seems to be connected to this strategy of a long period of learning early on in development. Okay, so let me switch gears a little bit now and say, okay, so we see this very general life history and learning relationship. And that raises the question of why. Why would we see this? Why would we see this long period of childhood? And why would the long period of childhood be associated with the kind of intelligence that lets us deal with environmental variability? And to answer that question, we can turn to results from AI. And in particular, one of the go back to Turing's famous imitation paper in 1950, and Turing at the very beginning of trying to think about AI suggested that maybe instead of trying to produce a program that simulates the adult mind, you should instead try to produce one which simulates the child's. And I, of course, have loved this quote for the past 30 years when I've been trying to work on this project of a computational model of children's learning. But for a long time, everybody read that paper up to the point where he talks about the imitation game, and then stopped reading it when he starts talking about children. And I discovered when I went to try and find this quote that now this quote is all over the place. And the reason, of course, is that the great advances in AI in places like DeepMind have been the result of shifting from trying to program in intelligence into a computational system to designing computational systems that can learn in the ways that children learn. So if you think about it from that perspective, think about what kinds of computational characteristics of children might enable them to have the computational powers that they do. Then you can approach this question about why a long period of childhood would be associated with a great deal of learning. Now, as I said, over the past now 25 years, my colleagues and I have been trying to figure out something about what the computational ideas, what the computational basis of learning in children is actually all about. And in particular, we've been thinking about this as a matter of Bayesian inference of generative probabilistic models. And that idea has become very prevalent in cognitive science. So the idea is that what children are doing is taking a bunch of statistics and information from experiments and intervention that they do, and using that to infer causal structure. And we have some nice normative models of how that's possible. Work in philosophy of science by people like Clark Gleamore and his colleagues, and work in AI by people like Judea Pearl and his colleagues have given us some really elegant, also work by people like my collaborators, Josh Tenenbaum and Tom Griffiths, have given us some very elegant normative models of how this kind of learning is possible. And, just parenthetically, in the context of philosophy, my first book was called The Scientist in the Crib, and I'm articulated what's sometimes called the theory, the idea that children are like scientists going out and inferring theories of the world. And really what this is a way of formalizing the idea of the techniques that you might use to infer theories of the world from data. So it's no coincidence that these ideas come from philosophy of science in the first place. Okay, and over the past 25 years, my lab and many others have done empirical work that shows just how incredibly good children are at doing this, that you can give them complex causal structures, complex patterns of data, and they're very good at inferring the structure from the data. And the way that we typically do this is we give the children information about a causal system, and you'll see in a minute, like our little Blicket machine, a little machine, we give them a pattern of data, and then we give them a choice between two different theories about how that system works. And over again, they make the decision about how the system works in ways that fit this computational model of Bayesian inference, in ways that look like Bayesian inference of a generative model. Now, the problem with that whole approach, which I love and have spent many years working on, is the search problem. So what we can do is normatively, we can say, okay, here's one hypothesis, here's another, which one has the higher posterior probability given the data. But of course, in real life, what's happening is that children or scientists or any learner or an AI system is as soon as those hypotheses get to be at all complicated and interesting, there's an enormous space of potential hypotheses. And it's impossible for any system, human or artificial, to go through and, kind of say, okay, this hypothesis has this posterior probability, this one has this posterior probability, this one has this posterior probability. You can't just, it's impossible. It would be an impossible task to solve the problem that way. So even though normatively we have a really good account of what's going on, we still have this terrible search problem. How do you decide which hypotheses you should even test or pay attention to? And in computer science and in neuroscience, but going back to the very origins of computer science, that search problem is an example of what's very generally a problem of exploitation and exploration trade-offs. So here's the problem. You have some big space to search, say a search of potential, space of potential hypotheses, a space of potential solutions to a problem. And you need to decide, am I going to just look in the space close to where I already am to quickly get a pretty okay solution to the problem? Or am I going to explore the space more widely? The advantage of doing this kind of low temperature search, as it's called, where you're just looking in the local space, just making small changes to what you already know, is that that's the exploit solution, is that you're quick to settle on a high probability answer, but you might miss a low probability answer. There might be a better hypothesis, a better solution that's different from what you're already thinking. Another way that you could search through the space, what's called a high temperature search, is that you could really bounce around the space. You could try one hypothesis and then try something that's totally different, and look for a little bit of data about one thing, then try to find data about some completely different hypothesis. And that has the disadvantage from an exploit perspective that you're slow to settle on a good answer. You're not going to be able to use that answer to actually act, but you're more likely to find this low probability answer. And I think if you just sort of think intuitively about your 4-year-old, do they seem noisy and bouncy and all over the place, or do they seem controlled and local? The noisy and bouncy is pretty much going to win the day. And it turns out that if you look at techniques for trying to resolve these explore-exploit tensions, a common technique is something called simulated annealing, where you start out with a high temperature search and then gradually settle on a low temperature search. Here's an example in a simple system that just has a particular maximum of the way that this works. And what you can see is that this helps to solve the problem of local optima. So in this system, for example, you start out here, and if you were just looking nearby, you wouldn't see any solution that was higher than the one that you were already at. But by bouncing around, you can actually, and by being willing to explore things that don't have as immediately good an outcome, you could end up with a solution that's globally optimal. So this is a very common technique that is sort of ubiquitously used in cognitive science. And my basic hypothesis is that childhood is evolution's way of resolving these explore-exploit trade-offs and essentially performing simulated annealing. So the idea is that you have this early protected high temperature search period, and then later on you will have the exploit low temperature search and the capacities that go with it. And in that special issue of Philosophical Transactions, I've articulated this idea. That's actually a pretty good summary of this whole talk. Now, if you think about childhood from that perspective, and again, this isn't just true about human childhood, it's true about childhood in general across many, many different species, what you see is that things that are features from the sort of high temperature exploration perspective are bugs from the low temperature exploit perspective, and vice versa. So many of the things that have traditionally been seen as evidence of a lack of intelligence in young children, things that have been seen as being cognitive defects, are actually cognitive advantages from the perspective of this explore capacity. So things like a lot of noisiness, a lot of variability, a lot of randomness, the fact that children will say one thing at one point and something totally different at the next point, the fact that children take what look like irrational risks, that they're impulsive, they don't seem to think through what they're doing, that they play, and across, again, an incredibly wide range of species, you see that play behavior is characteristic of young animals rather than old animals. And almost the definition of play is that it's an activity that doesn't involve work, that isn't exploitative. It's an activity that's just there for pure exploration purposes. And then again, another thing that you see across a wide range of species is that you see much more curiosity, what biologists call neophilia, in young animals than you see in old animals. And you certainly see that in humans. So the idea is that rather than thinking about a single dimension that's developing, we actually have developmental periods that have fundamentally different characteristics designed to accomplish fundamentally different tasks. And if we think about this from a computational perspective, some of the things that you might expect of children as exploratory searchers is that, as I say, they have higher temperature kinds of search. They have broader proposals. They're looking at more different possibilities. That's connected in interesting ways with the idea that they just don't know as much. They have flatter priors. So from a Bayesian perspective, if you don't start out knowing very much and having preferences for one hypothesis over another, you're almost by definition going to be searching more widely. And one element of the difference between children and adults may just be that as we know more, we rely more and more on our priors and rely less and less on the data. And that would make sense from a Bayesian perspective. And another thing that I'll talk about in a minute is that they have epistemic utility functions, meaning that rather than, say, getting reward from accomplishing a goal, getting more of a resource, getting a higher score, they are attempting to get more knowledge about the environment. So they're happier when they're finding out more, even if, as we'll see, finding out more means costs in other more obvious reward respects. And again, over the past, not that long, over the past 5 years or so, my colleagues and I have found a whole lot of different kinds of examples where children are actually better learners than adults. And it turns out that if you look at the literature in general, there are a number of these examples. Now, of course, if you're thinking about any kind of laboratory task, exploit capacities, executive function, are going to make you better at doing that task. So most of the time, if you give a problem to children and adults, the adults will do better. And across development, older children will do better than younger children. But there are these cases where it's the opposite. And what seems to be the common feature of all of these cases is that the problem involves inferring some unlikely, unusual solution. So, for example, we've done a whole lot of work looking at learning a conjunctive causal system versus a disjunctive causal system. And there's many more disjunctive systems. That's the assumption, the prior that adults have about how causation works. So when you actually have data that suggests this unlikely hypothesis, it turns out the children are very characteristically and consistently, and across children in Peru, children in Head Start programs, are better at learning those problems than adults are. And that's true for a number of other cases, learning in a social context, learning about situations versus traits, and learning relational versus individual concepts. Learning a foreign language versus your own language. Phonology is another kind of classic example of this. So I'm going to just talk about one experiment that we've done recently, very specifically oriented towards this question about exploration. And this is work with Emily Lequin at Princeton. And what we did in this experiment was we showed children our typical causal inference problem. So this is our ZAF detector, and ZAFs make the machine go. But we added a twist, which is that now we're pitting causal inference against reward. And this comes from a kind of classic tradition in the reinforcement learning literature that people here will recognize. So now what happens is you have this ZAF, and you get to decide whether you're going to put it on the machine or not. And depending on what the machine does, you either will gain or lose stickers. So here's this object, you put it on the machine, and it turns out that it's a ZAF, and sure enough, you get an extra sticker. You can all participate in this experiment now. Now you see this other one that's a different color, and you put it on the machine, and oh no, that one's not a ZAF, and you're actually going to lose 2 stickers. I've given this talk a lot down in the valley, and I always try and say to the Silicon Valley rather than the Silicon Fen, which is near you. And I always try and say, imagine this is like 1 billion stickers versus 2 billion stickers if you want to actually get a feel for the problem. Okay, now we've got another one. It's the same color as the first one. And now we're going to decide whether we want to put it on or not. We put it on and it's a ZAF, and we get another sticker. Now here's the crucial question. Now we've got this one, and this one is actually the same color as the one that wasn't a ZAF, and you have to decide whether or not you're going to put it on the machine. And remember, there's more of a loss. You get more of a penalty for a loss than you get an advantage for a gain. So you're more penalized if you're wrong than rewarded if you're right. So now the question is, what should you do? And I'll give you, all of you in the audience, a moment to think about it. Well, in some sense, you might think, okay, I've figured it out. The color of the block says whether it's a ZAF or not, so I'm going to avoid this. But it turns out that actually the way the system works is that rather than having this simple one-dimensional rule, it has a two-dimensional rule. So actually the rule is that if something has stripes and has black stripes, it's not a ZAF, but everything else is a ZAF. So you have to pay attention to both the color and the shape in order to be able to determine what is a ZAF and what isn't. And of course, if you approach, you're going to find that out. But if you avoid it, you're never actually going to figure out that that's what the rule is. And work with adults by Todd Garekis has shown that when you give this kind of a task to adults, they get stuck in what's called a learning trap. So what happens is, because they avoid ever getting information, they settle on that simple hypothesis quickly. They avoid getting information that goes against that hypothesis because it's too risky. And so they leave behind half of the reward that they could have accomplished. And this is a laboratory task, but you see this kind of learning trap in real life. And in fact, there's an argument that this is responsible for things like anxiety disorders and things like PTSD. So what happens in an anxiety disorder is, you get on the plane once and you have this miserable experience, and then you avoid getting on the plane ever again. But the result of that is that you never can learn that actually most of the time when you get on the plane, everything's perfectly fine. And the treatment for anxiety disorders is to expose the patient to a lot of examples where they're in the scary situation, but nothing bad happens. And that's the way to get rid of anxiety. So these learning traps are really clear in the lab, and they're real in real life too. So what we did was to give children of different ages and adults a set of 4 examples of these blocks, and they could decide, just like you just did, whether to approach or avoid the machine. And what we found is, just as Garekis found, that adults tended to avoid the negative blocks. And in fact, they quickly avoided the ones that were that fit the one-dimensional rule, which meant that they left half of the reward on the table. 6 to 7-year-olds were more likely to approach. And again, as you might imagine, if you have a 4-year-old, the 4-year-olds really liked putting things on the machine, and they would put things on the machine all the time. But of course, the real question is what happened in terms of their learning of the rule. And what we found was that when we tested them on the rule, in fact, the adults were not learning the correct rule. So the adults were sticking to this incorrect one-dimensional rule. They hadn't figured out what the environment was like, partly because they were using this risk avoidant technique. Whereas the 4 and 5-year-olds, 84% of them actually learned the correct two-dimensional rule. And I can talk some more about other control conditions that we did. But what this suggests is that the impulsivity, the curiosity that the children showed was actually leading them to learn better about the environment around them. And this is a classic example of the benefit of exploration versus exploitation. What we've been doing more recently is trying to take these ideas about exploration and play, and actually apply them to real AI systems. And we're just starting this work now, so I won't have results to tell you, but at least I'll have a method that I can tell you about. So if you look in the AI literature, people have been very conscious of this problem of the explore-exploit trade-off, and very explicitly inspired by work in developmental psychology. My colleagues at Berkeley have been designing algorithms that are actually driven by curiosity. And this is a very hot topic in AI at the moment. And what they showed was that you could solve something like Mario Brothers without any kind of reward at all, just with this curiosity-driven exploration. And the basic idea is that instead of being rewarded by, say, having a score, you're rewarded when your implicit model of how the environment works is violated. So these systems are trying to build up a model of how the environment works. And when something surprising happens, they go to that part of the space and explore more of that part of the space. And there's a whole lot of work in our lab and in others, which show that children are doing something like this as well. So what we've been doing is trying to see if we could do a one-to-one comparison between the ways that children are exploring and the ways that various kinds of curiosity-based AIs are exploring. And this is my wonderful student, Alison Gopnik, who's been working on this. And what we've been doing is using an adaptation of the DeepMind lab environment, the maze environment, and setting it up so that we could have children and AIs exploring in exactly the same environment. So here's what it looks like. We have this controller, and what you can see here is that the children are making their way through the maze, the same maze that you can use to test an AI in the DeepMind lab. And we can keep track of their exploration strategies and of the exploration strategies of, say, a curiosity-based AI. And I can talk maybe afterwards about some of the things that we're starting to see. I think the main thing is that even without a reward, the children will spend 20 minutes exploring this. We don't have to teach them about it, train them, ask them to do it. They'll just do it. They'll just explore it. And we see some interesting differences in the ways that children play when we have dense rewards versus sparse rewards versus no rewards at all, just free exploration. And we see the same kinds of differences in the algorithms. In another direct comparison that we're doing between the children and the AIs, we're working with, again, Eliza Kosoy, but now with a group at Google Brain, Corey Lynch and Igor Mordach and Pierre Sermonet. And Corey had done some really beautiful work showing that if you are thinking about a robotics problem, and robotics is a really good example of this kind of explore-exploit difficulty, so you're trying to get this robot to do simple things in this virtual simulated environment. And the idea was that you could train the robot by actually having it observe the activities that a human was doing. But the trouble is that if you actually get the robot to just watch the goal-directed behavior, the exploit behavior of the human, the robot will just replicate that behavior, but it won't generalize. It won't do anything new. It won't explore a wide part of the space. And, it's the general difference that we see between what children can do and what all current AI systems can do is that the current AI systems need lots of data and are very bad at generalizing, and the kids are the opposite. They have relatively small amounts of data, but they're very good at generalizing. And what Corey discovered was that if you just, got your Googler to play instead of actually trying to accomplish the goal that you were trying to accomplish, and then trained the robot with that play behavior, the robot was more resilient and did better kinds of generalizations, looked at more of the space. So what we're doing now is actually using a VR environment where we're putting the children in the same simulations as the robotic agents, and actually using the children's play as a way of trying to train the robotic agents. This is very frustrating because we had set up the environment and we'd actually tested 2 or 3 pilot kids, and then of course COVID hit and we're only just getting back to doing this. but at least in the few kids that we tested at the beginning of the project last year, Corey, I remember Corey looking at them and saying, I didn't even know that was part of the space. And as you can imagine, the children are looking around trying to break the VR, basically. You know, they're finding all the strange bugs and all the things that the VR does that are unexpected and surprising. So at least for those few children, it certainly looks as if they were exploring the space in a way that even brilliant Googler was not. So this is another example of trying to use VR and simulations to actually do a direct one-to-one comparison between what the kids are doing and what, but between the kids' kind of exploration and the kind of exploration that we would want in an AI system. Okay, now I'm going to switch gears and talk about the third part of the third kind of intelligence, this care and teaching intelligence. And to do that, let me give you an example of another experiment where kids are doing better than adults. This is not my work, sadly, but beautiful work by Nim Tottenham just came out in Nature. And it takes off from something that we know, again, about other animals. This is something that we know about rats. So if you think about the absolutely most classic foundational experiment in psychology, you put the rat in the maze, the rat goes down one arm and it gets shocked. It goes down the other arm, nothing happens, and it refuses to go down the arm that's shocked. That's like all of reinforcement learning is based on those Watson experiments. But again, if you think about it, you can see that that kind of avoidance learning risks being caught in a learning trap. And as I say, the most common theory about things like anxiety and phobias and PTSD is that they're the result of this kind of avoidance learning. And the reason is that's a very good exploit technique. It makes sure that you won't ever get shocked again, but it's not very good from an exploration period perspective, because maybe that environment has changed. Maybe now the environment is such that there's actually a foraging reward at the end of that maze. And what Regina Sullivan and her colleagues found was that adults behave just the way you would expect a rat to behave. But if you looked at juvenile rats, you saw the opposite pattern. So there were juvenile rats actually preferred the arm of the mat that led to the shock, which was kind of shocking. And what Nim showed, but there was a catch. And the catch was that the rats would only do that if the mother was present. So if the mother wasn't present, they would act like the adults. But if the mother was present, then they would explore the risky arm. And what Nim did was show that the same thing was true with 3- and 4-year-olds. She didn't shock them, but she had a really unpleasant noise that they heard. And what she discovered was that they would prefer exploration to risk, but only if a parent was present at the beginning when they were seeing the contingencies. And it's as if both for the children and for the rats, there's an implicit assumption that, you know, mom is going to make sure that nothing really terrible happens to you, a very important function of being a parent, and that because nothing terrible is going to happen to you, you can actually take risks and explore. So this leads to the second part of I guess the third kind of intelligence that I want to talk about, which is the intelligence on the other end, the intelligence of the person who's doing the caring, the person who's taking care of the brilliant exploratory agent. And I think it's interesting, you know, if you think about care in general, and I've had a bit of this reaction, it might seem like almost an oxymoron to think about care as being a form of intelligence. But if you think about it for about 5 minutes, you can see that actually being able to care for another agent is a really complicated and challenging task. That's a hard thing to do. And there's a particular kind of care, particularly relevant for humans, which is not just providing resources, but providing information. And this is a piece that I've done in Eon about this. There's a piece that just came out in The Economist where I've tried to translate this into policy that I'm very pleased about. And essentially, the idea so how does this idea of care connect to life history? Well, one thing that we know is that just as intelligence is connected to this longer period of childhood, it's also connected to greater parental investment. So here's yet another example from yet another species. These are marsupials. This is the world's cutest animal, the quokka. This is the world's least cute animal, the opossum. And if you look across these marsupials, even though the quokkas and the possums are the same size, the possums produce very large litters, 7 or 8 babies at a time. Only the biological mother is involved in caring for the babies, and the babies are mature quite quickly. They're out of the pouch within weeks. The quokkas only have 1 baby at a time. Both the mothers and the fathers are pair bonded and are involved in caring for the babies, and the babies stay in the pouch for as long as a year. Now, I suspect that many human mothers feel as if the possum's expression might be a better example of how they feel a lot of the time than the quokkas. We could all use more backlighting. But in fact, if you look at their brains, the quokka's brain is twice as big as the possum's brain. So again, this seems to be an example of this relationship between long childhood and larger brains and more intelligence. But this is also connected with how much parental investment we see. And you can see this kind of complementarity between a long period of immaturity and more investment to take care of those babies. And in fact, if you go back to human evolution, we have what I think of as the investment triple threat. So again, in this relatively short and rapid period in which humans evolved, we developed 3 adaptations that are really different from our closest primate relatives. So if you look at chimps, for example, again, most of the caregiving is being done by the biological mother. And in fact, biological mothers won't even let other members of the species get close to their babies. If you look at us in contrast, we have pair bonding, and there's actually really fascinating evidence that we developed that pair bonding during the course of human evolution in the fossil record. And pair bonding is that fathers and mothers are connected to one another, and that both fathers and mothers are involved in taking care of babies. Pair bonding is something we sort of take for granted, but in fact, it's very rare. Only about 5% of mammals show this pattern of pair bonding. It's a rare life history. And we also have what the great anthropologist Sarah Hrdy has described as alloparenting. So we have other members of the group who are not actually biological kin who are taking care of babies. There's a study by Barry Hewlett that shows that in forager cultures, a baby will be breastfed by 4 or 5 different women in the course of a week, for example. So quite literally, we have a non-kin who are taking care of babies. Again, very unlike our closest primate relatives. And then we have my personal favorite, which is that we have these postmenopausal grandmothers that I mentioned before. And as we'll see, that's also extremely rare. As far as we know, there's only 1 or 2 other species that have grandmothers who continue on past their fertility. And again, we've always had this extra 20 years of life. As you can see in this picture, if you look carefully behind those 3 beautiful children, there's a grandmother. And Kristen Hawkes, another great anthropologist, has argued that it was actually provisioning by these grandmothers that enabled the long period of immaturity in humans. And she has really fascinating data that shows that, particularly for toddlers, because we have so many babies so quickly, when babies transition from being breastfed to being toddlers, they're still very vulnerable. They still need a lot of care. And it's the grandmothers who are really keeping the toddlers alive. So you can predict how likely the baby is to survive based on the mother's resources, but you can predict how likely the toddler is to survive based on the grandmother's resources. Maybe I'll just mention parenthetically, I've just been writing a column about this, and I think we forget that for almost all of human history, this is for me a stunning fact that's either incredibly tragic or incredibly optimistic, depending on your point of view. For almost all of human history, until about 1850, there's a very consistent pattern, which is that half of the babies die before they're 1. A quarter of the babies die before they're 1, and half of the babies die before they reach adolescence. So these children are really vulnerable. They're really fragile. They really take a lot of caregiving and a lot of calories to keep going. And that grandmother investment makes a difference between whether a baby survives or whether a baby doesn't survive. Now, by the way, just in the past 30 or 40 years, it's only about 1% of children who die before their adolescence globally. And I think it's funny, this is one of those amazing things that has really completely transformed the human condition and is kind of invisible, I think, maybe because it's about babies. But if you look at this picture, it's funny because I used this picture when I started talking about parental investment, and I wanted to talk about grandmothers because it's a beautiful picture. But it turns out that this picture actually also very nicely illustrates something else, particularly human. Well, maybe not particularly human, but something else about grandmothers. So actually what the grandmother in this picture is doing is reading a 100-year-old copy, a first edition of A.A. Milne's When We Were Very Young, to these three grandchildren. In fact, not this copy, but my other copies of first editions of A.A. Milne come from the Haunted Bookshop in Cambridge, which I highly recommend, which was a terrible temptation that was around the corner from me when I was staying at King's College there. And I spent far too much money buying first editions of children's books. So what that means is that this grandmother is actually not only passing on resources to her grandchildren, but passing on information, and passing on information from 100 years ago, passing on information from the past. And one of the things that we know is distinctive about humans is that we have this capacity for culture. So generations can discover things about the world and then pass them on to the succeeding generations. As I mentioned, there's one other species that we know of that actually has these postmenopausal grandmothers, and that's the orca, the killer whale. And for a long time, I'd give this talk and say, it's us and the orcas, who knows why orcas? But it turns out in very recent work that orcas are also one of the few species that has cultural traditions. So the orca grandmothers live in a pod with their children and their grandchildren, and the grandmothers actually convey information about foraging, about what kinds of food to use. And the result is that individual pods will say just eat salmon or just eat krill, information that's been passed on from the grandmothers. And interestingly, going back to this point about environmental variability, especially when things get bad, so that the food sources change, the grandmothers can actually lead the pod to places where food has been available in the past. So the grandmothers seem to have kept track of the various kinds of food sources and rewards that have happened over time, and that 100 years or so of knowledge can enable the group to survive even when the environment is changing. And there's so what I'd suggest is that elders, these grandmothers and grandfathers too, people in that last 20 years with that extra 20 years of life, can serve this function. And there's some anthropological evidence in support of this. So this is a wonderful paper by Michael Girvin, who's an anthropologist at UCSB, also a paper in the same special issue of Philtrans. And what Girvin did was actually look at hunting in these forager cultures. And what he found, in some ways not surprisingly, is that something that all of us have learned very much in COVID is it's really hard to do something if there are a bunch of children around. It's probably good for the children because the children are learning, but it's really hard for the person who's actually trying to exploit. And what he discovered was that in hunting communities, what you've got is the hunters who are, the 35-year-old boy geniuses who are really expert, strong, very good, effective hunters. And it turns out that they actually go out by themselves to hunt because that's the most effective method. But of course, you have a new generation that has to learn the skills of hunting. And it turns out that the older hunters who are no longer as strong or as efficient, but who have this big body of knowledge because they've been hunting for a long time, are the ones who go out with the younger children. And that's the mechanism, and essentially teach the younger children how to hunt. So it's relationship between the elders and the children that actually enables cultural transmission to take place. And you see this if you look at the kind of content of what's getting passed on from elders to children, you see the same kind of structure. So this is a beautiful paper by the anthropologist Polly Wiesner. And what she did was look at conversations across the day in this particular group, recorded all the conversations between, more than 6 people across the course of 24 hours. And what she discovered was that during the day, most of the conversation was the adults talking about the things that they had to do. It turns out about 66% of it is what you called complaint, conflict, and criticism. So most of this, again, will seem familiar, I imagine, to anyone who's, been in a faculty meeting or an office. A lot of what's happening is saying, okay, we need to do this. And an awful lot is, and Joe is not holding up his end. And I'm really irritated by what, this other person is doing. So now when I come home from a day, I say to my husband, it's only 66% of my day was criticism and complaint and conflict. That's actually probably pretty good by human standards. But at night, when you couldn't actually go out and exploit effectively because it was too dark, what would happen is that the group would be sitting around the fire, and now the emphasis would switch to the elders and the children, and the elders would be saying things about the big parameters of the culture. So that's when you talk about things that happened long ago, far away, the kind of big structure of the way the culture worked. And I've argued, again, I'll just mention this in passing, if you look at the things that the children are doing, the kinds of things you get from that high temperature exploratory search, what you get are the large abstract parameters of the search space rather than the detailed individual pieces of information in the search space. And that seems to be the thing that the elders are passing on to the children. Not here's how you use this particular tool, but here's the things that are important in our culture in general. So what that suggests is that the elders are, now again, I should emphasize that regular adults can do all of these things. We explore and we exploit and we care in different kinds of contexts. But there's a real tension between those kinds of intelligence. And the developmental trajectory seems to be that even though adults can do all of these things, children and elders seem to be particularly adapted to fill this niche of exploration on the one hand and care and cultural transmission on the other hand. Now, if you think about what you have to do to be this kind of elder, it's very different from the kinds of intelligence that we typically think about. So this kind of cultural transmission enables a kind of cooperation, but the mechanisms that allow for care are very different from the kinds of mechanisms that we typically think of, the kind of intelligence we typically think of when we think about cooperation. So in philosophy, in moral psychology, in fundamentally, foundationally in economics, the picture of how we cooperate is some version or other of the social contract. So I have my utility function, you have your utility function. We trade off to solve prisoner's dilemma problems. We have tit for tat kinds of exchanges, and we have a lot of mechanisms to make sure that we don't cheat and that we hold up our part. That's a very general model of how human cooperation works. But if you think about care, if you think about a mom or a grandmother taking care of this helpless baby, it just isn't the right picture. That's not what happens. Even if there's some implicit sense that maybe this baby will take care of me, that's not what's happening in the moment. That's not how care actually works. Instead, I'd argue that the intelligence of care involves actually extending yourself so that rather than just having your own utilities, the baby's utilities, for example, become your utilities. It's just as important for you for the baby to succeed as for you yourself to succeed. And that's not just true about babies. It's true when you're taking care of elders. It's true when you're taking care of spouses, friends, anybody. Anytime when you're really caring, what you're doing is extending yourself to include the utilities of the other person. And what's even more true is it's not even quite just that, because in order to do this, you have to actually figure out, and particularly in the case of child rearing, you actually have to figure out and allow that other agent to design their own utilities, right? So part of what's so challenging about child rearing is it's not just, all right, these are the goals that I think this child should have, or even these are the goals this child has right now. What you want to do is act in a way that will enable the child to actually shape a utility function that will be the one that's suitable for them and one that's better than the utility function that you currently have. And that's an extremely challenging task. Again, we do this strikingly with children, but it's part of the challenge of, say, taking care of elders or taking care of people who are ill or giving a friend advice, where you have to sort of figure out not just what's good for you, not just what you think would be good for them, but what they think, and not even what they think would be good for them, but what they should think would be good for them. And that's an extremely challenging task, and some of the mechanisms, and we don't have very good social mechanisms for allowing that task to take place. In that Economist piece that I mentioned, I say that you could think about markets and states as kind of software that enables the social contract to be scaled up. And we don't have good ways of scaling up this extension of the self that is so deeply involved in care. Okay, last thing. I think that this actually applies to AI systems as well as to human intelligences. This is a beautiful book, a beautiful novella that I highly recommend to everybody by the great science fiction author Ted Chiang. And in this novella, he imagines a world in which people are actually raising AIs, raising software, and he raises all of the kinds of issues, deep philosophical and ethical questions that come up in human parenting. And Brian Christian, in his wonderful book, The Alignment Problem, has pointed this out as well. So everyone knows one of the deep ethical questions in AI is this alignment problem. How can we make sure that the objective functions that our AIs are accomplishing are actually good? So, how do we make sure that when we design an algorithm that says maximize your engagement in this social media, it doesn't end up saying, here's all the most horrible and outrageous and negative things that you could possibly think about, because that will maximize your engagement, to give an actual real example. And one way that people have tried to do this is by sort of trying to design an AI that would figure out what our utility functions are and just maximize them. I think of this as being essentially Stepford wife AI, where you have these AI agents that are really good at figuring out what we want and letting us do what we want. But I think if we have a real general AI, part of what we're going to want that AI to do is to be able to design novel objective functions that are beneficent, that aren't negative, that aren't bad. And that's exactly what parents do in the course of cultural transmission with their children. So I think at the moment, you could sort of say the poor little AIs have these, helicopter tiger mom programmers who are designing them so they're very, very good at accomplishing whatever it is that you want, sort of very good at getting to Harvard, but not very good at being flexible, designing something new, being able to, do their laundry. And if we want AIs that are actually going to be better, we're going to have AIs that have moms, and I think grandmoms, that function with this subtle intelligence of care that human moms and grandmoms do. Okay, sorry, I've gone a bit later there, but let me thank my collaborators, both in AI and in psychology, and especially the new generation of graduate students who've done all of this work, as well as some of the funders. And I'm happy to take some questions.